Thank you very much. I'll be quite brief because I've got some questions which I'd also, if possible, like to have some answers in the time remaining. I would just like to begin by thanking Anastasia and the whole team for a really stupendously interesting event. It's been an absolute eye-opener for me. I've gained, I think, priceless insight into the complex nature of Ukrainian society and the politics. And I'll do my best to try and convey that in my activities for the future. I'm not going to answer the exam question precisely, which was to say what the Ukrainians don't understand about Europe, for two reasons. First of all, because there is in fact no Europe to understand, because you know, we've got so many different factors in play. We've got the UK, we've got the Nordics, some ways quite closely associated with the UK, you've got Germany, and then you've got the whole Club Med, and all of them have a very different view of how this is to be, the problem of Russian imperialism is to be dealt with. But secondly also because in some ways you understand, I'm afraid, Europe very well. As I've heard, you understand that the Europeans will help you, they're helping you in some ways more and more, but they will never help you enough, I think, to win the war in a way that would be satisfactory. And there's not much to be said for President Donald Trump, but I think one thing he has been, in some ways, been honest towards the Ukrainians, in the sense of not promising something that he does not deliver. What I want to do instead is to just offer some reflection and ask some questions. I was very, very interested in what was said about the tension that emerged really between the military speakers who spoke about Ukraine after the end of the war having to remain, in many respects, a militarized society. And one can see why that would be the case, given the environment you live in. But also the fear of the civilians and also some of the out-of-uniform soldiers, that to do that would be, in a sense, to make Ukraine like Russia, to become the dragon that we're trying to slay. And that therefore, from that point of view, it makes a lot of sense to finish the war now, even with an unsatisfactory peace. The question I want to ask here is I see a paradox here, which is that the quicker the peace, of course, the less satisfactory the peace, and therefore the longer you will have to remain militarized. And that seems to me the difficulty that is hard to get out of it. It reminds me very much of Bosnia conflict. I studied quite a lot in the 1990s, where you had a cosmopolitan society in places like Sarajevo, which really found it very difficult to survive the pressures of war, particularly the Serbs who were loyal to the Bosnian government. It's not quite analogous to Russian speakers in Odessa, but you get the comparison I'm making. And the longer the war went on, the more cosmopolitan life suffered. The second thing that struck me very strongly, has been addressed again by the panel, is this tension between freedom and anarchy in the Ukrainian character, which is, on the one hand, the great source of resilience, as we've heard, and this sense of the experimental nature of the Ukrainian project. And here I think I agree with Garrett in the sense that I fear how this will go down with the European Union. I know there's this idea that Ukraine, because it has contributed so much to containing Russia, somehow has something to trade vis-a-vis Europe in this respect. In my world it would, but that is not the world of the European Union. If you think how little the European Union took the UK's defence role into account, admittedly that was 10 years ago, I think you would have another thing coming if you think that is going to make any difference in the negotiation, unless things have really changed, which they have, but the last place that will be recognised, I think, is Brussels. So think very carefully about your relationship with the European Union. And I say this as somebody who favours a mainland European unification. I think there should be a single European state. But that's not what you're joining. You're joining an acquis. And I think Gert is right, that it will not be a negotiation. It will simply be an acceptance. And then there was a question of history and the contest over history, which I found fascinating, and particularly in the panels on hybrid warfare and disinformation, to see how Putin had appropriated the record of the legacy of the Second World War, which of course is not only at least as much, but probably even more, a Ukrainian legacy as it is a Russian one. And my question here is, to what extent is there still, on the Ukrainian side, a sense of a shared history? I was very struck when I visited Ukraine for the first time just before the Maidan, by how many memorials there were, or mini museums in Ukrainian cities to the Afghanistan war, which is not something I think that you see in the Baltic states, even though the Balts also served as conscripts in the Soviet army. So there was a clear sense that this was a common heritage. You didn't feel different from the Russians in that sense, and I wonder is that still the case? And it reminded me very much of the way in which the partisan tradition, or the anti-Nazi tradition in Yugoslavia, was appropriated by the Serbs, and the argument was made that the Bosniaks and the Croats were fascists. So that even a leader like Franjo Tuđman, the Croatian leader, who had actually been a partisan during the Second World War, was put on the back foot. And lastly, final question is, I've heard so much in the last 2 days, which surprised me, and I think I gathered also from what was being said that a lot of this hasn't so far been talked about so much in public in Ukraine. And I just wondered, is there anything else that I haven't heard? Is there anything that has been left unsaid? If so, I'd like to hear it now, please.